Kwadcast Nation, I got a special guest for you guys. Okay, I've been following Temple online because her content is fire. It is blazing. Okay, folks, inspiring people to lose weight, and she has a story of her own where she gone through her own journey, and there's nothing more powerful than someone that has gone through it themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, I got the ketogenic nutritionist, Temple Stewart, in the house. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you. It's a total honor. I'm excited for this one. This is going to be fun.
This is going to be fun, and I really want to enforce that what you throw down on IG, it really is valuable. And I know you got stories to tell, I'm sure, about how your content has changed the lives of so many. But maybe we could start, Temple, with what landed you here? Like, how were you getting into the keto space? How are you becoming a influencer, if you will, when it comes to diet and nutrition?
Yeah. So I think it all really started. So I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in Mississippi. If you guys are familiar with Mississippi, it's known for its rich culture and even richer food. And so I grew up, eating all the things. And I had a bit of a weight problem when I was a kid, but nothing I really knew or thought was bad, and nothing my parents were concerned about. But, I was always the heavier kid. And so it really started there. I started having, the abnormal cycles, kind of the PCOS-like symptoms pretty young, and nothing was ever really done about it. It was always chalked up to, oh, you're an athlete, you play soccer, like it's probably just your physical activity, whatever. And so, I started to not really, I started caring about nutrition really when I was in college. I realized, hey, I feel real sluggish when I eat like trash. So maybe I'll start eating a little bit higher protein and things like that. But nothing really changed for me until I really got out of college. So I would really say that my college years were spent in sickness. I was overweight. I was probably 50, 60 pounds heavier than any of my athlete friends. And I just struggled. I didn't have any energy. My cycle was super weird. And I didn't know that I would get into the field of dietetics. I didn't even know that clinical dietitians spent most of their time in the hospital. I just thought, hey, I'm kind of interested in food. I like food. Let me get this degree and figure out what I'll do with it later. And so I got my dietetics degree, and still pretty heavy, and eventually landed myself at a VA hospital, which it's a Veterans Affairs hospital. I absolutely loved working with veterans, but I felt like an imposter. I was 50, 60 pounds overweight. I was still struggling. And here I was trying to counsel these people as a dietitian, and it wasn't working. I wasn't seeing any A1Cs go lower. People were getting sicker. They're diabetic. Everything was just getting worse. And so I got really frustrated with the norm. And, to put it short, I got my hands on some books, Dr. Ben Bickman and Dr. Jason Fung, kind of the heavy hitters in this field. And I started to change things. And that was really, I call it my young life crisis, because everything I had learned and was taught about being a dietitian and giving nutrition recommendations was really flipped on its head. And so when I started seeing these changes in my own life, I really started questioning the quote unquote dietetics model, and questioning this paradigm of whole grains and what's healthy, and, avoiding saturated fat and all these things that we were taught. And I was doing the opposite, essentially. And it wasn't long before I had dropped 50 or 60 pounds, and I felt better than I'd ever felt, in my entire life. And so that was really, I jokingly call it my young life crisis, but I really did have a lot of, it was hard to work in the hospital at that point, still giving these recommendations. And so that was really the turning point in my career. And, I left out a huge piece of the puzzle. I mentioned PCOS when we were talking, but PCOS really affected my young life. It was my first year as a dietitian, and I got this diagnosis. I had just gotten married, and, I'd always wanted to be a mom. And I sat down with this OBGYN, and they basically told me, like, you really don't have a lot of options. We need to put you on metformin, spironolactone, and birth control, and come back when you want to have a baby, and we'll have to get you on, Clomid and all the normal things that they do. And I just wasn't happy with that. And so that really kicked off, a large spark in me to figure this out on my own. And, now I call my PCOS reversible, in remission, whatever you want to call it, in the details. But that was a huge piece of my puzzle, is getting that diagnosis and basically being told there wasn't much I could do about it, and I found myself really frustrated with that, but it definitely kicked off the spark of going down this different path and away from conventional dietetics information.
Wow, wow. It's an incredible story, Temple. And I'm wondering, even, I know you touched on it a bit, but the classic dietetics teaching,
Yeah.
like what you learned in school, what you brought to your patients, what were some of the highlights that really came to mind when it came to informing your patients?
Yeah, so I'd only even heard of the ketogenic diet or low carb, high protein one time in undergrad, and it was from one of my favorite professors, and she truly meant well and wanted us to learn. But that's the first time I'd ever even heard of it, and I only knew that, oh, this is something that we use to treat people with epilepsy or people that are struggling with this and that and neurodegenerative disease, etc. But it's very rare, it's very hard, you'll never stick to it. You can't use it for diabetes and obesity. But the highlights of what dietitians are taught is very, very heavy carbohydrate, complex carbs, whole grains, legumes, those types of things. And there's quite a bit of fear still around saturated fat. I do believe that that's changing slightly with the younger dietitians, but there was very much a fear of eating too much red meat and eating too much protein and in having really any fat at all. And it was very calories in, calories out model, and that was all we were taught. If someone's overweight, they're obviously eating too much. If someone's overweight, they have no discipline. They need to exercise harder. They need to drop their calories. We were never taught about insulin sensitivity and making glucagon like peptide and all these things work in your favor. And so when I got out and I was practicing, I found it very frustrating, to be honest. My clients would come back and they'd be like, Temple, I'm starving. I'm eating less calories. I'm trying to do what you're telling me, but I find myself, binging at night because I'm so hungry and all this other stuff. So I would say, those are kind of the top highlights. There was really no mention of sugar being a problem or these refined carbohydrates being too much of a problem. It was all about quote unquote moderation and watching out how much you ate of this. And so like I said, when I got out and I got into clinical practice, I quickly realized this doesn't work. Like, people are sicker and getting bigger than ever, and there has to be some sort of change, or we've just completely missed the bullet.
Yeah, it's funny. We often make the joke, like in medical school. Actually, we don't even joke about it. We just say that your exposure to dietetics or nutrition is minimal. I probably got an hour or two
Yeah.
of training, and it was very conventional, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, saturated fats, not too much red meat, no concerns from the grains, and so on. And it's just amazing how different. Like, first of all, I mean, when it comes to nutrition, I think it is very personalized, but it's amazing how the opposite works for so many people. And what I learned in medical school, I in many ways I do the opposite, which is crazy. Like, high protein. I'll eat as much red meat as I don't limit my red meat consumption. I don't think about that. And it's incredible how we've come so far, and how little professionals like you and I were trained in other ways to empower our patients.
It is.
Yeah.
It's shocking, really, and I'm glad there's those of us that are changing the tide, right, and helping our patients in different ways, for sure.
Absolutely. So, I'm curious, like, how did you land on ketogenic diets for yourself? Because once again, you're mentioning many books and many influential people in the field of I don't know in nutrition that weren't necessarily keto doing keto diets themselves, but were whether it's low carb, whether it's intermittent fasting. So how did you land with keto?
Great question. So when I went to my OB, they pulled a lot of lab works or a lot of labs, and I got it back and I, of course, requested it. I'm like, okay, I can read some labs. Like, it's my first year as a dietitian. I was still very much green, but I wanted to see what was happening inside my body. And that's when I first saw the high glucose and the high A1C. And I left the office, looked on my, my LabCorp portal, and I remember thinking, shoot, this wasn't even mentioned to me. Why did he not say anything about my A1C? Like, this is higher, or if as high as some of the diabetes clients that I'm seeing. And so, or pre-diabetes. And so that really was where I started to think, oh shoot, like PCOS. Then I started doing my research on PCOS and I started to make all these connections. It's basically diabetes of the ovaries for the vast majority of people who have it. And I'm thinking my glucose is high, my A1C is high. And that's when I started to dig a little bit more. I went and requested a C-peptide and a fasting insulin and things like that. And I realized, I'm 22 years old at this time. And I was thinking, why are my numbers this bad? I played Division I soccer. I worked out often. I played soccer for 90 minutes multiple times a week. I should be like peak performance. My labs should not reflect this type of health. And so that's where I started to think, okay, what are some alternative methods? What I'm doing with my patients right now is not working. What I'm doing with my own body is not working. And I should say too, before I even got the PCOS diagnosis, I really was struggling with my weight and I started to try everything. So I went down the vegan road. I went down the whole my plate method and was counting all my calories and doing all that nonsense, and none of it was working. In fact, I probably made myself worse doing that because I was so obsessed with the numbers and the excessive exercising and all these things, and it just was making me puffier and more inflamed and all the things. And so when I started to look at the actual numbers is where I started to think, okay, glucose is elevated because I'm eating carbohydrates. Let me start lowering this and see what happens. So that was kind of my first couple steps out of the gate. And I started, oh man, my A1C is going down. Now look at my fasting insulin. It's going down. Oh, my C peptide is going from like 3.2 to lower. And so I'm thinking, this is working. And so I first started with low carb, and then I started to get tighter and tighter. I even entered a stage where I did carnivore for quite a bit. It was almost 4 months carnivore, just basically red meat and some limited vegetables. And so that's essentially what took me down the path. Is I was kind of adding my numbers up with the lab work and then looking at what my diet was doing. And it was constant improvement. So, I was taking this information from the outside that was telling me you shouldn't be doing this. This is backwards. You're going to get sicker. Yet my blood pressure was going down. It wasn't ever hugely elevated, but it was not in a great spot. And then my A1C started to go down. My fasting insulin started to go down. And so I was thinking, well, if it's so bad for me, why is all my numbers and why is all my lab work improving? And that's really where I stumbled kind of and found myself finalizing at the ketogenic diet, because I do like vegetables. I don't think there's necessarily inherently anything wrong with some vegetables. And so I just found that it was easiest for me to control my hunger. It was easiest for me to feel satisfied long term. And I don't necessarily think, everyone has to be keto. I think it just depends on your athleticism, like your lean muscle mass, your insulin sensitivity, etc. But for me at that time, I'm a dietitian sitting in a hospital 8 hours a day. I'm not getting a ton of movement. It really just fit, and it really improved my numbers quite a bit.
Wow. And what kind of timeline, Temple, when you whether it's the low carb to keto or altogether, like in terms of where you are, what got to where you are now?
So that was probably about 6 years ago, but I'll tell you this, in about 3 to 6 months, I had lost the majority of the weight. In about 3 to 6 months, I had lost about 40 pounds. And I have played with my diet since then, just kind of figuring out what I want to feel best on. I've had a baby since then, so obviously things changed with that a little bit as well. But I lost that initial bout of weight very quickly. And I see that in a lot of my clients as well. And now I feel really good about where I am diet-wise. I do a bit of carb cycling based on my workouts and training and stuff. And so, yeah, I feel good. And I'm open to changing in the future if that's what it takes. But my lab work is phenomenal. And my last A1C was a 3. I mean, not A1C, fasting insulin was 3. And so I have a lot of these good markers. But I would say initially it took about 3 to 6 months. And I started losing weight the first week I tried it, whereas I had been trying these calorie counting and vegan, and I did Weight Watchers, and that was a mess, and Noom, and all the things, and it just was a struggle. I'd lose half a pound a week, gain 2 pounds the next week. It was just a mess.
Wow. And so you learn this for yourself. You go through the exercise of going low carb to keto. So how did you bring this to your clients, right? Because once again, as a professional, it's always tricky when the guidelines say to do A, B, and C, and you're doing X, Y, Z. How was that journey?
But it was a little shaky at first, I'll tell you this, because I was still a clinical dietitian, so still working in the hospital under the influence of a lot of endocrinologists, hospitalists, all the things, and so I was still handling the diabetic that came in for this and that, that's getting whatever amputated, and I'm having to go explain why your sugars are so high, and so I was really nervous initially because remember, this is like my first or second year as a dietitian, and I'm young, and all these veteran physicians and everything. It was very intimidating. And so I started very slowly incorporating low carb with my veterans, and I would float everywhere. I was kind of a float dietitian. I'd be inpatient, I'd be at the diabetes clinic, whatever. I started mostly in the diabetes clinic, and the endocrinologist there had never really used low carb, certainly was not using keto, and we started to get phenomenal results, so much so that people, the VA, like different clinics from where I was sending their patients up to our clinic because we were getting them off so much insulin, and we were getting off the metformin and all this stuff. And so that was the first time as a dietitian I had ever felt I'm actually making a difference in these people's lives. They're coming to me, they're, having way less infections. They're not having all this high blood sugar issues. They're feeling energized for once instead of feeling so slouchy. And so I watched this in my veterans, and that was really like the light bulb moment that I think I realized I will never be able to go back. I don't think I'll ever be able to get this information out of my head. And even the physicians that I was working with were really super supportive, incredibly kind, and I think that a light bulb went off in their head as well, because they were pulling in all these patients from everywhere. I got so much I couldn't even like keep a caseload because it was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, because these people were getting such good results with this, and it was very little talent on my part. It was just like, hey, let's fix the root cause of what you're dealing with, and the results speak for themselves on their glucose monitors and their lab work. And so it was shaky at first because I didn't have a ton of support from my own colleagues in terms of dietitians and upper management. But when the physicians started jumping on board and I had a super supportive endocrinologist that was working with me, it was like, all right, well, you can't really speak against this because it's working so well. These people are getting much, much better quickly.
Amazing. And what I love about this is it empowers so many folks. It empowers the dietitians to realize that you are altering the course of people's lives. Like, you're literally saving lives by introducing, like, we're trying to reverse their diabetes or improve their sugar control. We see the complications on a regular basis. But it also empowers the patient to realize that you got this. Like, you could really do this. Like, turn your life around based on how you eat. And so I'm curious, Temple, when it came to making those changes for your patients, was this because, like, a lot of, I mean, not to sound like Debbie Downer, I don't know what the term is, or like some patients just don't want to change, right? They're just not that. They don't want to put in the work, or there's just too many obstacles in their way. So I was curious to hear, was the buy-in easy? Did you have to ease some of these ideas into place? Did you just introduce keto cold turkey? Like, what was the general approach to a lot of your patients?
Yeah, so initially I think it was a very big learning curve for me to really be confident enough as a young dietitian to have hard conversations. Because at first it was very me skirting around the bush of like, okay, well, this is going to happen if you don't do this. And then I got to the point where like, oh no, I don't want this patient to come back to me or end up in our ER with a problem, And so I started to be very honest and blunt and open. And then, what helps too is I really, I gathered all these diagrams and I explained, like, this is the glucose curve when you eat carbohydrates versus the glucose curve when you have a steak. And so I started explaining a lot of this much better and kind of learned a good flow in terms of making this stick and in a digestible manner. And I really believe that the vast majority of my patients wanted to get off these medications, wanted to lose weight, wanted to get this under control. And once I explained, like, this is the reason we're doing what we're doing, it clicked for them as well. Now, as well as I do, there's some that you can lead a horse to water, but it doesn't matter what you do, they're not going to drink it. And so I had my fair share of patients like that as well. but ultimately, I think the vast majority, when I really explained what was going on, what the purpose behind this was, and showed them results, I would have pictures of other veterans in my office that had before and after, that had given me permission to share. And they were like, yeah, I want that too. And so I think I think it was received well when I took some time to explain. The problem with working in the clinical setting is a lot of times I had 10 minutes with a patient, and then I was getting shoved out of the room because someone else was coming in or whatever else. And so that's ultimately what led me out of the clinical setting. Was I didn't feel like I had enough time to address and fully help people. I feel like I was just throwing papers at them, and as they're getting discharged on their way out. And so yeah, I think that answers your question. I think ultimately it was received well when I took some time and was able to explain it well as well too.
And Temple, would you have to? Would you suggest something gradual? Like that's where I was always curious. Can you say like, okay, you're stopping your whatever your grains today, and you're having increased protein tomorrow? Like, how would you introduce that to folks?
Yeah, totally. Some people, their first thing that they needed to focus on was not high protein, low carb. It was like, you need to stop drinking a 6-pack of soda every day. So
Right.
like, it kind of just depended on where that individual was. And I think that you made a comment earlier about how nutrition really needs to be individualized. And I completely agree. Some people's problem right at this moment isn't like getting enough protein, and it's stopping by Dunkin' Donuts every single morning. We've got to cut that habit. So it's all about triage. What's causing the worst problem for them in that moment. And then I think once the client or patient or whatever realizes, okay, I can do this, then you move on to the next problematic habit. And you really, before they know it, 6 months down the road, they've lost 20, 30 pounds, and they've kicked all these habits that they thought they would never be able to break free from. And so, yeah, it was very gradual for some. And then I had the occasional patient that was like, you know what? To heck with it. I'm going to quit everything tomorrow and feel fantastic. And that was more of a rarity, but I had some of those as well. And, they would experience extreme change pretty quick as well.
Oh man, I hear you. And so after transitioning from the hospital setting into your own shop, how was that transition for you? Was that like, it must have been freeing to a certain degree, knowing that there's less constraints on you. But what was that transition like? And then when did you become the ketogenic nutritionist? Like, when did that start to blow up?
Yeah, it was by accident. So my husband and I adopted my oldest daughter in December of 2019. And I wasn't happy with sending her to daycare all day. She had a traumatic experience in life before us. And so I really wanted to be a little bit more available. And I had already been thinking in my head, okay, I can't see myself working in the clinical setting from here on out. I'd really like to be my own boss and control my hours and really spend time with a lot of my clients. And so I tossed around the idea. I actually quit the year that March 2020. So that was a busy year for all of us. And I quit that month, and that's when I started my Instagram. And I thought, my husband's so supportive. He was like, oh, you're going to do great. This is going to be awesome. Like, you're going to be your own boss and get all these clients and help so many people. And it was true. By June of that year, I had already exceeded my client caseload at the hospital. And so, I think there's so many people that are so desperate for help, whether it's online or just, your average Joe. It really, the results speak for themselves in this case as well. And so my clinic, quote unquote clinic, telemedicine practice really went well on Instagram and social media. And so I just kept it up, and I was able to stay at home with my daughter, and I eventually got pregnant a year later. And so, yeah, that's kind of that year of 2020 was when it really started. I would say 2021 was when I really knew, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
Wow. No, I'm we all are grateful that it worked out, Temple. And I'm wondering, even just given a few testimonials of the practice of folks really transforming their health and their trajectory.
Yeah, I had several veterans that actually followed me from the hospital to my telemedicine clinic, which was very flat. Like, it just was so honoring to me that they trusted me so much to leave what's being paid for their healthcare to use their own money and continue with me. So I had several of those. I had several veterans that had dropped A1Cs down to normal range, that had currently been on several different oral agents for diabetes. I had several veterans that had lost 60 to 80 pounds, some of which I still keep in touch with today. And so those were some of my initial ones of 2020 of like, man, these veterans are following me over here and they're still seeing this incredible success. And now they're going back to their VA doctors and telling me, hey, I followed this VA dietitian. And so, that, and I've had over 35 women with PCOS get pregnant, which I think is, it's truly, I think infertility is one of the hardest things that someone can ever go through. And so to change your diet, to maybe implement a couple supplements and then get pregnant, I've had several of those go through multiple rounds of unsuccessful IVF. And so some of those testimonies of like, it's less about cosmetic weight stuff and that disease management. It's more about like, I want a child for my family. I think some of those have been very emotional for me as well, and to watch them flourish and then get pregnant again. And so some of those have been incredible. I had a client recently lose over 100 pounds. She's been working with me since beginning of 23. And so, just some of those things where you're like, I never would have seen myself impacting these people, but now they'll remember me for the rest of their life. And that is a huge weight, but also an incredible honor to see that these people have just put in so much work. And when they really had not a lot of hope, maybe in conventional medicine in some ways, or they never thought I would be able to get rid of PCOS or hypertension or this metabolic stuff or anything, IBD, all of it, a lot of this stuff can be reversed. And when they realize, oh, I can be disease free, I can be free from the burden of obesity, it's just, I don't know, it's really cool to watch.
Oh man, it's everything. Like we mentioned before, you are literally transforming somebody's life, and the ripple effects you have too. That veteran, that woman that was having trouble getting pregnant, they mentioned Temple and the work that they've done together to get to a good spot. People are inspired when they see that. They're inspired when they follow you on Instagram and see the transformation. So I am right there with you. This is powerful stuff. I mean, I often say on our show, like I work in acute care, obviously in the ICU, and that's obviously super satisfying when you can save a life.
Yeah.
But when someone hears your content or hears an episode like this and then starts to transform their lives too, like that is just as powerful, because they're avoiding eventually landing in that sick care system.
Yeah, to you. They're eventually, coming to you or ER or whatever else.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious, just to give some people some glimpses into, say, like a ketogenic diet or a relatively low carb diet, what would be a typical lunch, breakfast, supper that some of your clients would be jumping on the train for? Because a lot of people that I know, when I bring up the idea of keto, they automatically think of 95 bacon, slices of bacon and so forth. So, pardon me?
I said, and a block of cheese, bacon and a block of cheese.
Of cheese. Yeah. So I think it's worth getting into maybe a bit of the weeds in terms of samples of diets that you would recommend to your clients.
Totally. And I'll give you a sample of my day. And I want to say too, really anyone who just kicks refined carbohydrates, and refined carbohydrates, cookies, crackers, chips, anything baked, those types of things, is compared to the rest of the population eating a lower carb diet. And so when we say low carb keto, there's nuances around it. Keto is definitely much lower carb. But just understand, just even getting rid of those processed foods, for anyone listening, puts you in a different category than the majority of the population. And so that's usually my first step. For me, a ketogenic diet, like I mentioned earlier, I follow a little bit of a cyclical diet. So when I lift heavy or I'm running ways, I will typically have more of like 40 to 60 grams of carbohydrates that day. But on a low carb day where I'm mostly sedentary or not getting as much movement as I probably need to be, a normal day looks like. So I usually have 3 eggs for breakfast with kimchi or kimchi pickles or sauerkraut, something vegetable. Sometimes I'll just cut up maybe some cucumbers and dip them in a little bit of guacamole or something like that. And then I try not to snack, and I encourage clients really, if our meals are formulated well, we really shouldn't necessarily be needing food in between each meal. And so usually lunch I'll have, a piece of protein, whether it's grilled chicken, steak, a burger, salmon, more eggs, whatever, depends on. And I usually try to keep that to about a third of the plate, or 6 to 8 ounces, kind of just depends on where I am. And then the rest of my plate is filled with non-starchy vegetables. So I try to do like basically a whole open hand of non-starchy vegetables at that meal, whether it's a salad or grilled asparagus or, boiled green beans, whatever. And then I'll typically aim for a lighter dinner. So I have found that I just do better when my dinner is very light. And sometimes I'll even pull that dinner up a little bit earlier, try to eat before 4:30 or 5 if my schedule allows for it. And typically that's, again, another piece of protein, and then maybe just a smaller amount of vegetables, a smaller amount of protein as well. And so I really kind of stick to the whole foods. There are some things I like that would be considered quote unquote processed, but very minimally. Like I do meat sticks pretty often. And
Meat sticks?
like a meat stick, like Chomps or Vermont is some brands that we have here in the States.
I have no idea what that is. A meat stick?
Oh yeah, you'll have to give me your address. I'll send you some of them, but it's just like it's just like, I don't know, beef jerky or something like that. But the stick is like, large and long. And so it's, what's the other one? Biltong. I like biltong quite a bit if you've had,
Yeah, that stuff is delicious.
Oh, it's the best. It's the best. So those are kind of the things I'll do on the side, and then I'm not afraid of fruit. Sometimes I'll have fruit, a little bit of a lower glycemic berries or, a smaller apple or, maybe a half cup of pineapple. I'm not afraid of whole food carbohydrates. I just know that if I let them get out of control, they'll get out of control. And before I know it, I'm eating a whole mixing bowl of fruit. So I just watch that. And so that's kind of a day for me.
Yeah. And with that day, like what's your recommendations for protein intake? Because I must say, as I've gone through this non-professional, but interviewing a lot of folks and reading my own material, like definitely the hack is reduce your processed food for sure, but protein is magical.
Oh, it's magical.
Yeah, like I've said it many times, increased muscle mass, glycemic control, insulin sensitivity, as I mentioned, keeping you fuller for longer, less likely to snack on crap as a result. And so, I was curious to hear what your opinion is in terms of volume for protein.
Usually, I think a safe thing to say, like in a public platform like this, is 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. So if you weigh, 210, but you want to be down closer to 165, aiming for 165 grams loosely. I don't tell people like you don't need to overeat until you're sick of protein to hit that number, but I think that can be a good aim, a good, goal to hit. And then even further, I'll go with my clients. If I give them a number like that and they look at me like, you are bonkers, there's no way I'm hitting that. I tell them, okay, aim for 60% of that at first, because you know how hard it is. If you haven't been focusing on protein a long time, to up your consumption pretty quickly can be challenging for some. And I implement all the hacks. I'll put collagen in my coffee. I'll use nutritional yeast on my salad. I'll do things that it's not necessarily making me sit and eat a large amount of protein or meat or something like that if the individual can't really stomach it or they're not used to that, etc. But that's usually a safe number for me to feel comfortable. Some people like the recommendations of 30 to 40 grams per meal if you're eating 3 meals a day. I think that's a pretty good one too, just depending on the individual's activity level and things of that nature.
I never heard about the yeast hack. Can you tell me about that one?
Yeah, so nutritional yeast, it's made by Bragg's, the same people that do apple cider vinegar. It's almost this like cheesy flavor. It really is. A lot of people use it as a cheesy replacement, but it's got like 8 grams of protein per like 2 tablespoons. It's very, very small amount of, and it's like flakes. So it's this cheesy flake kind of thing. You can put it on anything. And I really learned about it when I had children because, you know, they eat one thing one day and then the next day they don't want a part of it. And so I was trying to constantly get their protein up, but the nutritional yeast kind of tastes like cheese, and it's also oftentimes fortified with B vitamins and things. So I would tell people, if you've got MTHFR or something weird like that, you don't handle B vitamins well, maybe get the unfortified version, but it tastes very good, and you can put it on vegetables, you can put it on chicken. People put it on popcorn for like a cheesy popcorn thing.
Man,
Yeah.
so where do I get some?
Whole Foods, Sprouts, any of your like, you know, kind of crunchy grocery stores, a little bit health food stores, they'll have it. You could definitely get it online as well.
Amazon, you think? Or no?
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's on Amazon for sure.
Booking it, I gotta try this one,
Yeah,
especially for
try
my
it.
boys.
Yeah, it's yeah. The kids have no idea. You know, it tastes like cheese, so it's kind of like, it's not exactly like cheese, but you'll have to let me know what you think.
Oh, I'll definitely let you know. And calorie wise, is there much to it, or?
You know, I think if an individual is hitting their protein goals, I don't necessarily like to harp on calories, especially if they've done the whole weight loss yo-yo game in the past, and calories are one of those things where it's like, oh, I can eat more. I've got 400 calories. I'm going to go eat an ice cream bar, something like that. So calories make me a little nervous in that realm, but I do monitor them. So I don't think you can in fact, I know you can't overeat calories. You'll still cause a problem long term if you're over consuming calories, but like you said, protein's magical, and when you're consuming enough protein, there's typically not an overeating problem. And so I kind of handle that on an individual basis, but I think that's a good rule of thumb, is just kind of figure out where that individual stands with calories. If they hate tracking and all that stuff, I'm a fan of tracking for most of my clients, at least initially, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Calories are kind of a yes or no depending on the person.
Oh, sorry. I was referring to you. I was going to ask that question specifically, but I was referring to the yeast. Like, is there much calories in the yeast?
No, I think it may be 60 per 2 tablespoons. It's very low. It's very low calories.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then you also said you put collagen in your coffee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, collagen, not a complete protein. So I tell people, like, this can't be your only protein source today. But 1 scoop of collagen has anywhere from 8 to 10 grams of protein as well. And so why not put it in something liquid? You can get multiple different flavors of collagen. You know, I use Equips. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that brand, but Equip Collagen, they have a very good high quality brand of collagen that's it's made from grass-fed cows, regenerative ag. It's very high quality. I use that, and you know, if I have 2 cups of coffee a day, I've just gotten nearly 20 grams of protein, basically on accident. You know, so I do that as well.
Glorious. Yeah, I really like that, thinking about ways to squeeze it in, because I think there was a colleague of mine that mentioned, like, I was leaving some recommendations of protein intake online, and it's like, how can I do that and not overdo my calories and all these things, and how can I get, and so this is just more fuel, I think, to empower folks in finding ways to get more protein intake. Do you so you're a former collegiate athlete, like soccer was your huckleberry?
It was.
What's your thoughts on low carb / keto when it comes to athletic performance?
Yeah, you know, and I so wish that I had found all this before I competed competitively in college, because I really struggled a lot of the days. I really struggled with energy. I would have a hard, you know, we were doing the typical, like, chug a energy gel before, just the stuff that it's like, oh my gosh, I wish I knew better back then. But, you know, I think that every athlete is different. And when I get athletes in my telemedicine practice, it really depends. You know, when I get PCOS athletes, I immediately get transferred back to when I was struggling. And so I definitely know I should have done lower carb in college, and I would have felt way better performance wise. And I am not afraid to use whole food carbohydrates strategically in those athletes as well. You know, and that's completely different to my husband, who's like, you know, 6'3", does CrossFit all the time. Like, he can handle some carbohydrates and his insulin stays at 2, you know, and so it really just depends, I think, on the amount of lean muscle mass, the pancreatic compromise, if you will, from like a PCOS athlete or something like that. I think that that's the way to look at it, and also just go off of what they're telling me. If they're telling me they're struggling to get through a game, then maybe we should up the carbohydrates a little bit. But I also hear about these ultra endurance athletes who are like completely carnivore and feel fantastic. So it's like one of those things where it's like, I think it really just depends on the individual. I think that you could do it right doing both methods.
Do you have any viewpoints on carnivore? Do you think it's safe? Do you think it's something that has a place for some folks?
100%. Yeah, I absolutely do. It really made a difference for me, I think, with just understanding satiation cues and hunger cues and things of that nature. So yeah, I'm absolutely pro carnivore. A lot of carnivore people may get frustrated with me because I think vegetables are okay for the vast majority of people. I don't think, things like lectins and oxalates are always bad. I think certainly in some cases, specifically with people like autoimmune IBD or gout or things like that, where we really need to look at maybe removing some of those things. But I think in general, most people can handle vegetables. But I also think carnivore is very good for some people who just aren't at a place where they can monitor or moderate things. For some people, introducing starchy vegetables really causes them to kind of go off the rails. And so I think that's another one where I know it's annoying to say, but it's like one of those individual bases. But I've seen so many people do so well on carnivore that I don't think that we can deny it working. And I think that it definitely has a place for people, specifically some of those conditions, like I mentioned, autoimmunity and things like that. But, you see Sean Baker's stuff and all these people who are just absolutely thriving on carnivore. So it's hard for me to try to deny it. I think it can work.
Yeah, no, the testimonials are pretty impressive. I always like to ask the nutritionists, the experts, to hear their insights. Like we've had Phil Ovadia on, who's a cardiac surgeon, that big carnivore proponent of carnivore in his diet and advocate, and so yeah, the testimonials are definitely impressive. I just haven't. I don't know too many people personally that have tried it, but yeah, it's interesting to see. How about we never touched on fasting? Like, do you have an opinion on time restricted eating or intermittent fasting?
Yeah, you probably saw that study that came out a couple days ago, right?
This 91% cardiac disease or something like
horrible.
that. I just thought today, actually.
Oh, it was so bad. Yeah, I mean, it's not based on anything. I think Dr. Bickman just posted a really good video debunking it. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of fasting, to answer your question. I think when done and used correctly, it can be a phenomenal tool for people. I think where we need to be a little bit cautious is most of the research done on fasting is not done in women. So I think we have to be a little cautious with cycles, specifically, reproduction, pregnancy, breastfeeding. I think it gets slightly more hairy there, where we need to just pay attention to hormonal changes. I think some people overdo fasting. Like, I usually don't recommend women, especially reproductive age women, fast every single day. And when I do recommendations for fasting, I tend to like people to fast dinner or pull dinner up earlier than I do this constant breakfast skipping. But again, this is another situation where some people just, the minute they eat in the morning, they're hungry for the rest of the day. And so I think it kind of depends on your schedule, what's realistic for your family. Are you having family dinners at night and then you're just sitting there while everyone else is eating? So I think things like that we should look at, but I do recommend intermittent fasting. I think it's a great thing to go alongside keto, low carb, specifically for people with, metabolic disease like hypertension. Some of the best results I've gotten with blood pressure and A1C and blood glucose is with fasting in combination of keto, as you know. So yeah, I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting. I just think with women, especially reproductive age, we just need to be a little bit more cautious. I've seen plenty of clients that'll lose their cycle or something like that and then come to me trying to lose weight, but also keep a healthy reproductive cycle. And I think sometimes we tend to just do a little too much right out of the gate. So I think it's great overall.
Yeah, I was late to the game too. I do the time restricted eating. Like I skip breakfast. I've been doing that for 5 years, mostly just for convenience. And I would often recommend that to colleagues and say, give it a try. And what I did notice that trend amongst women, not only reproductive women, but even like the perimenopausal
Yes.
women, that it just wasn't working, and they were. My humble opinion is you're too stressed, like it's drawing too much cortisol, so that the
100%.
impacts are not there, and it's one of those things where I always say, listen to your body. If you're hungry, eat, man. Like you don't have to push. It's 11 and you want to push it to 12. Like if you think about that at a high level, it's a bit nonsense. But I personally love it and encourage it for folks that to try it. But the point you made, like if I were to have the ideal scenario, it'd probably be, as you mentioned, eat supper earlier. And then I really think that's probably the most logical, like when you think about circadian rhythm and like optimizing health in general, that probably makes the most sense.
Yeah, 100%. And there was a study. I keep talking about Dr. Bigman because he's the one who introduced it to me. But it was on his page, and it talked about some of that. It talked about there was better visceral fat loss, there's better A1Cs, even inflammation lowering when skipping dinner opposed to the other control group that was skipping breakfast. And so I thought that was pretty interesting, but I completely agree with the cortisol. I think that's where we take like a stressed out population and then we stress them out even more with the intermittent fasting, and it's like, oh no. But personally, I do skip dinner, and right when my kids get home, they usually get home at about 4, sometimes a little earlier, I'll have dinner ready and made, and then they'll eat. Sometimes they'll snack later, which I'm totally fine with, but we still are able to do dinner as a family. We'll go for a walk in the evening or something like that, where it's like, okay, we don't have to eat at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I got a couple quick hitters for you too. Like I heard you mention lifting heavy and exercise. Where does that? What's the approach for many of your patients when it comes to exercise?
Yeah, so I meet them where they are. I would say most of my clients don't lift heavy, or I haven't ever lifted before. And so I think just simple steps in the right direction of like, we need to build lean muscle mass, because there's only so much you can do diet wise before it just gets extremely restrictive, and or you stop seeing results if there's like zero lean muscle mass. And even in my clients, it's like, I don't necessarily need you to go straight to, Orange Theory or do CrossFit, but like, let's get some bands, or let's do some resistance uphill walking or something to build that lean muscle mass. So I really value lean muscle mass. I think it's one of the best things we can do for mortality and frailty as we age, etc. And so I definitely encourage it in every single one of my clients. And then I like some of the, steady state cardio and lower impact if the individual is just got high cortisol, all the issues going on. And so I incorporate both resistance training and cardiovascular exercise. But I think it's a must when we talk about longevity and health and chronic disease prevention. And the more muscle mass, the better. I encourage a lot of my clients to get a DEXA scan or do your RMR through them or something, just to have an idea of like, okay, this is my visceral fat opposed to my muscle mass. And so it's interesting to see a lot of women fear lifting weights, and I hope to break that stigma, because it is really your best friend when it comes to weight loss.
Could not agree more. All right, last question.
Okay.
What do we got to do as healthcare providers to get the word out, like to change the landscape? It really is an uphill battle, but it's such an important one. It's a loaded question. I just was curious if you had any insights.
I think doing what we're doing now, I think using the same channels that young people are using, doing the same thing that the generations under us are doing, getting podcasting out, just like you're doing YouTube and social media. And ultimately the results speak for themselves. So like, people are waking up to this. People are already kind of realizing, okay, conventional medicine will save my life, but it may not be the best avenue for me to prevent chronic disease long term. And so I think just continuing to spread that word of like how doing it the way the younger ones are doing it, and making sure our message is heard by them too. And so I think there's with titles comes a lot of respect. And so I think using that appropriately and making sure that, we're telling our testimonies, we're showing the testimonies of the people that are working under us, and doing all the things that you're doing and all the other influencers and stuff are doing in this space to get the word out. I know. I wish there was a magic wand we could wave, right, to like get everyone to hop on board, but I think people are slowly waking up. At least I've seen it in the last, 4 or 5 years that I've been doing it.
I love it. I love it. Temple, this was amazing. Amazing. I really appreciate you landing on the show and sharing your insights. Where can people learn more about you?
Yeah, so I'm on every platform, TikTok, Spotify, Instagram, all the things, Facebook, as the.ketogenic.nutritionist. And yeah, thank you for having me on. It was an honor. And if anybody in your audience has questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But this was a lot of fun, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Temple. We're going to have you back. Knowledge being dropped everywhere.
I love it.
Thank you.